Mariah Johnson had always known that the world wasn't built to hand her anything, not opportunity, not fairness, not respect, and especially not success, and though many little girls dreamed of princess crowns and fairy tales, Mariah grew up in a two-bedroom apartment in Atlanta where the walls were thin enough to hear her mother crying at night after long shifts as a nurse's aide, where the refrigerator hummed louder than her own stomach on days when dinner was no more than toast and peanut butter, and where dreams weren't luxuries. They were survival tools, and from the very beginning she learned that if she wanted to see a future beyond the cracked sidewalks of her neighborhood, she would have to fight for it with every ounce of brilliance and stubbornness she possessed, because nobody was going to simply give her a seat at the table. They didn't even want her near the building, but Mariah was different, sharper, her eyes scanning the world like puzzles she could solve if only she had enough time and enough willpower. And it started as early as kindergarten, when teachers whispered to each other during parent conferences that, "She's smart, but sometimes too outspoken," code words that meant they were uncomfortable with a little black girl who asked questions that pushed past their shallow explanations. Questions like why the world map in their classroom had the United States in the center when she knew other countries had different maps with Africa in the middle, or why books about inventors never showed people who looked like her, and those whispers only grew as she aged, becoming sharper in middle school when classmates mocked her for raising her hand too often, when teachers accused her of cheating because her test scores outshone students they believed were naturally brighter, when even counselors tried to guide her away from advanced classes because they might be too challenging, though Mariah aced them all, and by the time she was in high school she had learned to wear their doubt like armor. Each sneer and side-eye feeding her fire instead of breaking her down, each whispered, "Who does she think she is?" echoing in her mind as motivation to prove exactly who she was. And when she received her acceptance letter to Harvard, the same counselors who once doubted her suddenly plastered fake smiles across their faces and told her they had always believed in her. But Mariah never forgot the doubt. She carried it with her across the country to Cambridge, where her freshman year at Harvard Business School was another battlefield. The classrooms filled with wealthy legacy kids who wore privilege like expensive cologne, their fathers' names etched into buildings across the campus, their conversations sprinkled with vacations in Europe and yachts in the Caribbean, and there she was, the daughter of a single mother, working 2 campus jobs to afford books, sitting in lecture halls where professors praised the loudest voices while ignoring her careful, razor-sharp analysis until her answers became too correct to dismiss, and though they tried to laugh at her southern accent, at her thrifted blazers, at her braids, she never flinched, because every insult was just another line in the script she was writing in her head, the script of a woman who would one day sit at the top of the very world that mocked her, and so she studied harder than anyone, networked with professors who saw her worth, interned at firms that barely gave her coffee-fetching tasks but secretly memorized every number on every balance sheet she touched, and by the time she graduated, Mariah didn't just have a degree. She had a vision, a map etched into her brain of how power moved, how companies grew and fell, how men shook hands in rooms assuming no woman, especially no black woman, could ever outthink them, and she promised herself she would build something they could not ignore, something too vast, too precise, too powerful to be laughed away, and so she started small, with a tech startup idea born from late nights coding in her dorm room, scraping together funding from small investors who believed in her drive if not her identity, and when she sold that company for a few million at the age of 27, she reinvested every cent into acquisitions, learning the art of staying quiet while making moves, building MJ Global Holdings piece by piece until it became a silent giant, buying stakes in industries where people didn't even notice her name attached, and all the while the whispers continued. At conferences, at meetings, at fundraisers, when she walked into a room full of men in tailored suits and heard them murmur, "Who does she think she is?" while smirking at each other, assuming she was someone's assistant, someone's secretary, someone there to take notes rather than deliver them, and each time she smiled politely, letting them believe whatever made them comfortable, because Mariah knew the sweetest revenge was not to argue but to conquer, and conquer she did, year by year. Acquisition by acquisition, her company's web tightening around old institutions until one day, her lawyers slid across her desk a thick folder with the final pieces of a deal that would change everything. MJ Global Holdings now had majority control of Harrington Cole, the same firm whose executives once brushed past her without acknowledgement, the same firm that built its reputation on gatekeeping women and people of color out of leadership, the same firm where whispers of arrogance floated in gilded halls as naturally as dust motes in sunlight, and she would be walking into their boardroom not as a guest, not as a supplicant, but as their new CEO, though none of them knew it yet, and as she prepared for that meeting, standing before her mirror adjusting the collar of her black dress, she thought of her mother, of the little girl who once asked why Africa wasn't in the center of the map, of every sneer, every dismissal, every, "you don't belong here," and she smiled, because the whispers that once wounded her had become the fuel for her empire, and soon those same whispers would be replaced with stunned silence, the kind that follows when a storm finally arrives after years of thunder rumbling in the distance, and with her leather folder tucked under her arm she walked out of her office, heels clicking against the marble floor, ready to write the next chapter of her story not with pen and ink but with power and ownership, ready to show them exactly who she was.